heard. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light." The Gospel of the Lord. So these last 2 days from the prophet Isaiah, we're hearing passages about foreign nations here in Israel. So Isaiah is a very long book of the Old Testament and about 17 chapters. So basically like chapter 11 to chapter 27, it's basically God pronouncing his judgment on all of these other nations. So first of all, his judgment upon Israel, but then upon other nations. We heard yesterday about Assyria, how God was warning Assyria, that God had actually used Assyria to take over the northern part of Israel, and Assyria was becoming prideful and had its sights set on the southern part of Israel. Right? So it's just kind of one of these insights from the book of Isaiah. It's one of these emphases, these themes, is that God allows certain nations to arise in power, but he also has the ability to humble them. Right? One of the great ironies of this is actually the northern part of Israel, just before they were taken over by Assyria. Right? We talked during the prophets of Amos and Hosea, as we were reading through there, that the prophets Amos and Hosea were warning the northern part of the kingdom. Ironically enough, just before the northern part of Israel was taken over, it was basically at the height of its political power and its economic power. And yet it was taken over by Assyria and was lost everything. Right? The same thing eventually happened in the southern part of Israel. God allowed the Babylonians to come into the southern part of Israel and to take over and to destroy the temple and everything. Right? And the people had been warned by the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. Right? This is something that we see all throughout the Old Testament. It's the rise and fall of different nations. Right? I think it is important for us to reflect on this, and especially in our own age with the state of the United States. Right? I think we have been a world power for so many years. It's easy to think that maybe it will just always be this way. But in terms of world history, our country is still very young, right? And we seem to be losing our soul, right? Just like in the days of Israel, right? Just as all those people, those followers of God, it seemed to be losing their soul, losing their identity, abandoning the one person who had allowed them to arise, right? God himself. And we are finding ourselves in a similar state here in the United States today. We have this terrible idea in our culture today. Right? You can call it deconstructionism. You can call it revisionist history. Some people call it leftism, right? Not to be confused with Democrats, but a leftism, it's kind of a Marxism of sorts, which has this idea that it wants to destroy the past and destroy what currently is so that there can be a completely new future. And in schools today, in history curricula, right? Most often people are taught about the very worst things that has happened in the United States and in our country. And unfortunately, there are so many beautiful things about our history that are ignored. Right? Take, for example, the feast day today. Right? Ask an average high school student in the United States today, right? What is the relation of the church to the Native Americans? Right? What will they say? Probably the only thing they can think of is how the United States oppressed the Native Americans, right? And this idea of colonialism, this idea of the Western Europeans coming over to North America, right, and civilizing the peoples who were here. Right? Most high schoolers are taught at how terrible this was and how oppressed everybody was. They aren't told about people like St. Kateri, who was a fruit of the immense labor of the various missionaries that came over, the people who shed their blood, gave their lives, spent years and years toiling for the spiritual fruits of conversions. One of the things that many people don't recognize in the history of the Native Americans in the United States is actually how influential the Catholic Church was in the state of the Native Americans. Many of the most famous Native Americans that you have heard of, many of them were actually Catholic. One of the great tragedies in our nation's history was when the government wanted to give lands to the Native Americans in particular, but part of that also was they expelled, right, white people from those areas. Practically speaking, for the Native Americans who had largely been converted to Catholicism, what did that mean? That meant all of their priests were expelled. It means they lost all of their Catholic schools that had been funded and run by sisters and priests. Right? There's a lot of beauty to our nation's history, and especially our land, especially if you ignore, our history shouldn't just be reduced to political issues. And we also have to remember the great heritage that we have received. And the sad thing in our nation today is that so much of that history is being whitewashed, it's being overlooked, and even vastly misinterpreted. Right? Most famously with the story of Christopher Columbus, right? This man who used to be a national hero, a world hero, right? Part of the reason you could argue that so many people today have disavowed the heritage of Christopher Columbus is precisely the fact that he was such a typical European. He was such a typical part of our nation's history. Right? He was a very devout Catholic. One of the first things he did when he landed on the shores was he planted a cross. And he was adamant about bringing missionaries over. One of the reasons why he has been largely erased in our nation's history today, why so many people don't even want to celebrate the feast day that we have always had as an American holiday, is because his arch political rival, right, wrote a scathing critique of him. Right? Kind of the equivalent today of 200 years from now, someone took as their number one historical source for Donald Trump is a memoir of Hillary Clinton, or the opposite. Right? So much of our beautiful history in our country, right, is being overlooked. Perhaps maybe the most striking example of this that I can think of, and again, something that you would not hear about, is actually Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XII was the Pope in the mid-1900s, right? And he came to the United States in the early 1900s, and this was a guy who was familiar with the onslaught of communism and the soon arise of the Nazism in Germany, right? He made an apostolic visit to the United States. And if you read his diary, one of the things he wrote in his diary was he said, the United States is the hope of the world. There's something special about the United States of America. And it was kind of prophetic, right? What happened later on in the 20th century, right? We were instrumental in World War I, World War II, and the fall of communism at the end of the Cold War, right? So many things that we should be proud of our history. And the Catholic Church is a huge influence in that as well. It should not be overlooked. But unfortunately, in so many schools today, in universities, colleges, high schools, right, we hear the exact opposite. People are taught at how ashamed we should be for our heritage. There's so many beautiful things we should celebrate, and St. Kateri Tekakwitha is a great opportunity to recognize some of those great contributions that not only our nation has had for the world, but specifically our Catholic faith has had the influence here in our land.